Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Francy Marin wash processed Colombia from Passenger Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Passenger, based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And their coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Rosa Jimenez, a wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. This is, of course, the same coffee that we recently reviewed from Subtext, and it was actually that Subtext coffee that prompted me to purchase this one. As soon as I found out that Passenger was also carrying it, I wanted to compare and contrast it from these two coffee roasters. In addition to that, given the first couple of impressions I did have from the Subtext version of this coffee, I was curious to see if that's just how the coffee was, or if it was Subtext's take on it. So purchasing it from Passenger was definitely going to give us an idea of how this coffee is. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how the two compare, as this right here is day 44. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This is a perfect opportunity to compare and contrast the roast profile from these two coffee roasters. And this one did feel the more developed of the two. Now, given that the Subtext one wasn't necessarily the lightest out there, I can say that this one was probably skewing even more on the more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. Again, I wouldn't necessarily say that it goes too far to the extent where I would say it was close enough to a medium, but this coffee probably had a fair bit more development than I was expecting going into it. And for that reason, I would say still, once again, on the more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and my first impression of this coffee was actually significantly better than it was of the Subtext version of this coffee, as it had more depth and definition when comparing it alongside that Subtext version, as it's better balanced in terms of the brightness and sweetness with a better defined stone fruit-like sense to it. Lovely fresh stone fruit qualities to go with a bright red berry characteristic. So they do have, I want to say, is it a plum or a nectarine characteristic to it? It's a nectarine characteristic. And I could definitely see that from this first try. I said stone fruits are significantly better defined in this coffee. So I assumed that it was going to only improve from this point going forward. Day 17 through the Chemex, and it wasn't quite as good this time around, as it's a bit more generic in a berry sense with a slight savory quality to it as well. Pretty intense, as it's not necessarily the cleanest coffee, and I feel like that was the takeaway from this coffee in general from either Subtext or Passenger, is that it really doesn't act that much like a true wash processed coffee. Previous prominent fresh fruit qualities are also absent this time around, so my favorite part of that first try was not present this time around, so this was an okay day, especially in comparison to the first time trying it. Day 20 through the UFO Brewer, and the coffee is a little better today as it's still offering a nice level of balance, but the focus does remain on the darker berry qualities of a Colombian coffee, so that heavier kind of grape characteristic that we often associate with the Colombian coffees, especially more processed Colombian coffees. Fresh stone fruit feel once again, as there's a bit more of it in comparison to the previous day, as there's also a slight fruit tartness to it, giving it that Kenyan-like characteristic. So better mixed impressions nonetheless. Day 23 through the V60 with Passenger's recipe, which once again is one that I wouldn't have brewed with if it wasn't their recipe. 15.67 to 1 at 99 Celsius, and it made the coffee the most unique it had been across either roaster or any of the recipes or brew methods we brewed with this coffee, as there is some big robust qualities off brew and a very savory vegetal quality, as it does finish off in a very clean and well-defined darker stone fruit sense. And that's why I was confused as to whether or not it had some sort of lighter stone fruit or darker stone fruit, because on this day it was just extremely plum forward. With that being said, it was buried underneath some strange vegetal as well as savory and robust qualities of this coffee. So very opposite ends of the spectrum on this day. Day 26 through the Chemex with Passenger's recipe, and the coffee isn't quite as good as the previous day, but it also has less of the smokiness, which is strange, as coffee seemingly hasn't just been inconsistent across recipes and brew methods, but it's also been inconsistent even across roasters, as it was never overly consistent in the subtext version of this coffee or in the passenger version of this coffee. And that seems to be the case this time around, as it does have a little bit of that savory olive-like quality that is also pretty common in more processed Colombian coffees. It still has a little bit of that stone fruit-like sense, but maybe not necessarily to the same extent as on previous days. Neither of the Francy Marins that we had acted like a true wash-processed Colombian coffee, both of which felt like they had just a little bit more processing to them in general, and it's playing in the way that we get a lot of these characteristics from more processed Colombian coffees in general. On day 29 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15-1 at 90 degrees Celsius, and it's a little bit better in comparison to the previous days. It has toned down some of those unusual savory and vegetal qualities. We mentioned in the subtext that there's a very strong tomato aroma at times. It's also present within this coffee, as I feel like it's just what this coffee offers. It still has that prominent Colombian processed feel to it, but better definition to the other fruit characteristics. So mixed in general. Day 33, same adjustments through the Chemex, and there's a similar sentiment in comparison to the previous day, as it still has a bit of a strange tomato-like characteristic. Trade-off not really worth it, as the stone fruits are a bit more tame this time around. So on day 37, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's back to feeling like it's at its best, largely because it has slightly better definition to the stone fruit qualities. So I love these full circle moments where we brew a coffee for the first time. It turns out nice for us. We go through all of these adjustments, brew methods, changes, only to come back to our standard recipe with our first brewer and find that it was the best that it had been the first time we tried it, which a lot of people can relate to that. Nonetheless, it has very big red fruit forward characteristics, bright Kenyan-like qualities to it, some traditional feel as well in that Kenyan-like sense. A little bit of blood orange hibiscus-like qualities to accompany all of it. So a little bit more detail and depth on this final day, largely because I feel like it presents in a cleaner and more even sense. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And I have the wrong tasting wheel pulled up. I have the subtext tasting wheel pulled up. So let me go ahead and pull up the passenger one. And the reason I have the subtext one pulled up is because I was looking at the subtext one before this review because I wanted to see how it compared to the passenger one. And they are very similar looking tasting wheels. And I was kind of surprised by that because I never looked at the two of them side by side, but there are some slight differences. We will go through the passenger tasting wheel real quick. And since I already have the subtext one pulled up, I might as well discuss it alongside the subtext one. Finish level 5, that was consistent among both of these coffees, as both of them seemed to have a surprisingly extended and long-lasting finish to it. Not necessarily in the most even sense either, as it did have those more processed Colombian qualities to it, even if it wasn't overly intense. So yeah, level 5 where we opted to put both of those. Sweetness level 5, acidity level 5, sweetness level 4, acidity level 4, florality level 4, all the same for both of these coffees as well. Now the sweetness again is presenting in a slight stone fruit-like sense, but for the majority of it, I do have to say that it's just that intense, more berry quality of these coffees that we're getting a lot of the sweetness from. Acidity level 4, it presents in a Kenyan-like sense. I really don't know what to make of it. This coffee, as I jokingly say, the Copa de Oro competition is a competition to see which Colombian coffee can taste the most like a Kenyan coffee, because this one took home first place and it's very Kenyan-like in a lot of ways. So level 4 for the acidity. Florality, I mentioned some hibiscus-like characteristics. Again, it's acting like a Kenyan coffee, so a lot of the qualities within this tasting wheel are going to be reminiscent of Kenyan coffees. Same thing with the berry fruit level 4. While it does present in that more heavier processed Colombian berry sense, it also has a little bit of those tart berry characteristics to it. So I can see cranberry currants, that sort of characteristic. That's also scoring there at the level 4, same as it is in the subtext tasting wheel. Here's one of the few things that differs. The subtext one, we had a level 4 for citrus. This one we only have at a level 3, but we also had the stone fruit at a level 3 for the subtext tasting wheel. I was able to get some faint traces of the stone fruit qualities. Obviously, in both these coffees, it was my favorite characteristic when we were getting them, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it was the most abundant, clean, or even throughout the entirety of it. Citrus fruit, I feel like the other one acted a little bit more tropical than this coffee did, as we had that toned down. I'm still getting a little bit of those tropical characteristics, but not to the same extent as it was in the subtext coffee. And then we have the savoriness also scoring there at a level 3. I got tomato and slight olive characteristics from both of these coffees. So the olive characteristics were a little bit more abundant in this one. The tomato characteristics were a little bit more abundant in the Subtext one. Body level 3, that was the same for both coffees, as both of them had that more juicy Kenyan body-like texture to it. But then the final and most important thing we're discussing, and this is where these coffees differed the most. Cleanliness scored a level 3 for this coffee, and it scored a level 4 for the Subtext one, and that is because the smokiness of this coffee did score at that level 1, where it scored at a level 0 for the Subtext one. And that's what I'm alluding to when it comes to the profile of these coffees. This one did feel just a slight bit more developed, and I really wanted to demonstrate that within this tasting wheel, because while the difference was slightly marginal, it was enough to the point where I felt a little bit more roastiness, a little bit more smokiness from this one than I did from the Subtext one. And the Subtext one, as a result, did present a little bit cleaner because both of them had those same savory qualities to it, but I felt like having one coffee be more absent of a less desirable characteristic, in this case the roastiness, did justify it being a little bit higher in the cleanliness and lower in the smokiness. So that's why we put both of them where we did. Outside of that, though, the cleanliness of this coffee wasn't to the extent I was hoping for. I've mentioned that quite a bit throughout the reviews of both of these Francy Marin coffees, as it really doesn't act like a true wash processed coffee in a lot of ways. So level 3 is where we opted to put that. Outside of that, though, I found it very funny that the tasting wheels looked as similar as they do, but I also believe that this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It is so strange that I thought, based off of the first time trying this coffee, that it was going to be significantly better than the Subtext version of this coffee. The main reason I purchased the Subtext version of this coffee, or the main reason I purchased this coffee to begin with, was because I didn't have the best results with the Subtext coffee, and I assumed that it was just Subtext's roast of the coffee, but it turns out I just don't think I like this coffee in general, which is why it's funny to me that this coffee did win the Copa de Oro competition. At least with the Subtext version of this coffee, it had a resurgence at the very end. This coffee never seemed to have a resurgence. I could never get it to be similar each time we brewed this coffee, but that was also consistent among both of the roasters, as this coffee is just so tricky. And given the feedback that I had heard from the Subtext version of this coffee before we released the review, I have not released that review as of the time of recording. It hasn't necessarily been the most positive, and I haven't heard any feedback from the passenger version of this coffee either, so I really don't know what to make of it. Again, I just don't think that this is necessarily my type of coffee to begin with, given just how Kenyan-like it acted throughout the entirety of both of these reviews. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, it does have a lot of traditional Kenyan characteristics presented in a slightly more robust sense. So that's the direction I want to go. It has a very lingering, long-lasting quality to it as well. So I mentioned in the Subtext review a combination of an Ethiopian coffee with a Colombian coffee, a Kenyan coffee with a Colombian coffee. That's the same thing with this one. Not truly washed Colombian characteristics, but plenty of very intense Kenyan characteristics. So combine those two in a slightly more developed profile, and that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Francy Marin Wash Processed Colombia from Passenger Coffee. Thank you for watching.